Welcome to Marriage and Family Theory, Chapter 4, The Family is a Psychosocial System. We will discuss this chapter, but one caveat I would like to present at the beginning of the lecture is this chapter has many definitions that are the basis of the final exam. They will also be seen on the Marriage and Family exam when you're sitting for licensure. So I want to be sure that within the discussion that we are very clear about the correct definitions and how these definitions correlate to family systems and family therapy. On the first page, biologist Ludwig von Bertalanffy, which is probably a terrible mispronunciation of his name, but he is the theorist who first proposed general systems theory, which has been refined over the decade. It was an attempt to get a comprehensive theoretical model together that's relevant to all living systems and organisms, and then to overlay that onto family therapy. It's an assumption that any organism or entity as a family has complex interactions of all of the elements, which would be the individual family members and all the subsystems thereof. And that you cannot study a family, treat a family in isolation, that everything interlocks together. General systems theory and first order cybernetic concepts relate to scientific methods. It's proposed from the 40s. Mechanical concepts of physics and engineering, that again, they tried to take the mechanisms of machine work and factory work and overlay that into family therapy, family patterns. It's a poor fit. It was the only fit they had, but it does not directly overlay. So, but if you look at general systems theory and first order cybernetics very loosely, then you can see a connection that a family is an organism with intermoving parts and that it only works as well as its weakest member. Homeostasis, families seeking balance between stability and change. Even positive change upsets stability and homeostasis. Families strive to go back to equilibrium. Open systems, how families exchange information within its environment. How do we communicate messages to each other as family members? How do we communicate those same messages internally to ourselves, those same messages externally outside of the family system to the larger systemic environment? Recursive sequences and circular causality, the top of page 71. Both of these are terms on the MFT exam that clarifies interconnectedness of members as participating in self-corrective feedback loops that help the family seek and maintain balance, steadiness, homeostasis. Circular causality is that if it affects one member, it affects all. There's not a direct cause and effect. It's circular. Recursive sequences, if things are out of order, you're going to get repeated messages, verbal and nonverbal, overt and covert messages from your family to remediate behaviors so that homeostasis can then be achieved. Systems theory is an overall concept. It encompasses general systems theory and cybernetics, but it focuses on the relationship between elements versus the elements themselves. The relationship between the family members versus each individual family. The relationships between the subsystems. The other term you may hear for subsystems, and particularly on the licensure exam, is holons. Holons. It is a synonym for subsystems within the family. The couple, the parent, the sibling, the parent-child subsystem. Constantine in 86 proposed that systems terms were not to be used by therapists with any precision because they don't perfectly match, perfectly fit. This is true. She said they should allude to the idea of a family as a complexly organized, durable, ongoing causal network of related components. A lot of words just to say that it's family members,
we're all connected by blood, by living environment, by choice, by force, but that how we function directly correlates and in a circular causality relationship to how the family functions as a whole. Postmodernists, counselors who left from psychoanalysis, psychodynamics, client-centered, and went into things such as narratives, feminist, solution-focused, as DeShazer with solution-focused. They criticize system theory as a concept. They admit that families possess constructs, rules, feedback, homeostasis, borrowed from cybernetics and general systems, but that the metaphor is too general to describe what actually happens. Feminists also take exception with this thought. Most postmodern theorists take exception with terms such as functional versus dysfunctional, preferring to have terms that are families in distress or problematic families, families that have an issue to deal with versus a family that just doesn't function as a whole. Is there anything that we need to, because this particular chapter is widely lecture-based, but I do want to open the opportunity for any comments or clarifications?
None yet.
None yet. Please feel free to stop if there's anything that we need to discuss. Looking at characteristics of family systems, organization and wholeness. Those are keys how systems operate. Even the most chaotic family is organized, even if it's organized around chaos. If you think that organization is a predictable fashion, if chaos is the order of the day, those elements as an entity and whole, which is greater than the sum of its parts, very much like a Gestalt dynamic, it follows no system can adequately be understood or explained, broken down into component parts, because it's not just the individual parts, it's no one functions in isolation or independently, the family functions as a whole. Family rules. We are rule-governed, we're a rule-governed society, we're a rule-governed system. This very much relates back to Freud's view that between the baser choices of sex and aggression, the superego, the morals learned by families, schools, churches, the legal code, and the rational self, the ego, and in between. How we balance needs and wants, rules and regulations, shoulds and woulds. The interaction of family members typically follow organized, established patterns. It enables each person to know what is permitted or expected of them. That does not mean that what is permitted and expected in a certain family meets a therapeutic definition of functionality. They can meet their expectations in a very dysfunctional way, a very problematic way, but still operating within the rules from that family system. Don Jackson, who was a pioneer in family therapy, who was on the licensure exam, observed family interactions follow persistent patterns and rules. He was the first with that. And that marriage partners face multiple challenges as collaborators. How to earn a wage, how to do housekeeping, to socialize, to make love, to parent, how to maintain the parental system, the couple system, and that those things are culturally, contextually, developmentally, environmentally linked. Page 75, this particular page has several terms that we need to very clearly understand. Family rules determine the way people pattern their behavior. So Don Jackson said there's a concept of marital quid pro quo, describing the marital or partnership relationship as a business contract. I will give him this and expect this in return. And that when both partners feel like they've given and received what is an equal, satisfactory partnership relationship,
then the partnership is sound. If one partner feels they give too much, another partner feels that their needs are not being met, then changes in the balance to the homeostatic relationship within that partnership must change in order for the partners to continue in a healthy relationship. Redundancy principle, also a term proposed by Don Jackson in 1965. He hypothesized that redundancy operates in family life because we interact in repetitive behavioral patterns. If we're taught to meet at the dinner table in a certain way, to come home at a certain time, to find our friends and sexual partners within a certain population, that message is repeated over and over and over redundantly until it is learned. Or, and if family members are compliant with the learned expectations, the family kind of maintains homeostasis. When family members operate outside of those taught expectations, families can experience distress. Doesn't mean that the behavioral rules that a family has proposed for their members meets therapeutic standards, it meets functional standards, it means that it just simply is. Some families are very chaotic, some families are coherently organized, some families are very rigid. Whatever the family dynamic is, there still is a redundancy principle of repetitive behavioral patterns ingrained. These are the expectations. Yes?
What is the value of redundancy principle?
The idea is to explain how we socialize and educate our family members. So, how do you learn your role as a daughter, as a son? How do you learn your role as a sibling, as a student, as an employee, as a neighbor, as a consumer? Those things are repetitively taught, redundantly taught, so that when you operate outside of that, there's a very clear message to that member that they violated family patterns and themes. Causes great distress.
Like someone who's taught you don't date outside your race and then they do and you're disowned, right?
Right.
What if you have a poorly adjusted family of people, and that is the norm, and then one person becomes slightly more adjusted over the years? What happens to the family norms? What happens to the unit?
Well, the roles begin to change because the rules don't necessarily change. The rules can sort of stay the same. So when the roles change and the rules stay the same, there's a huge disconnect. If you look at addicted families that have been rocking along dysfunctionally but going to work, raising their children, and because you have one partner who is an enabler and one partner who's an addict, however problematic, chaotic the family may be, that relationship usually is solid. Because an addict needs an enabler needs an addict. Okay? The addict gets a DUI, goes to court, goes to drug court, goes to probation, mandated treatment, begins to get clean and sober. The role of the enabler has dramatically changed because you don't need me anymore. And those relationships tend to blow sky high. And when the relationship breaks up, the family breaks up. Because we varied from the homeostatic balance, however dysfunctional it might have been, it was our normal, and it's the way we've socialized ourselves around our rules and our roles, and that balance has been disrupted. And quite frequently, the addicted member will relapse so that balance can be restored, and the family can survive, even dysfunctionally. So when you're working with those families, you have to be prepared. That and Mnuchin said this in structural therapy, that he disrupted alliances, he disrupted power and hierarchy. And when that happens, the family's thrown into chaos. His belief and Whitaker's belief was that when they were thrown into chaos, you could then take them from the rubble and rebuild a bigger, better, faster, stronger family.
Is this still the way it goes?
It is the way those theorists from that theoretical orientation operate. It doesn't mean that it's always effective. Rules are descriptive. They're metaphors describing patterns of change, interchange, or they're prescriptive, directing what can and cannot occur between members. Descriptive. Who do you date? When do you come home? Prescriptive. Is incest okay? Is physical violence okay? They're formulas for constructing and maintaining family relationships within a family rule. So an example of a descriptive rule may be based on prerogatives and obligations determined by age, sex, and generation. Do you go to school? Do you go to work? Do you contribute to the family income? Do you get to stay up late? Do you get to date? Some are negotiable, others are not. Rigid families have way too many rules. Chaotic families have way too few rules. Within the family structure, family members learn family meta rules, which are the rules about the rules, just like meta communication is the talk about the talk. And it's unstated, it's usually nonverbal, family directives. And it gives you principles for interpreting the rules, enforcing rules, and changing the rules. Prescriptive rules, descriptive rules are stated nonverbally. They're transmitted nonverbally. Prescriptive rules are stated overtly. You don't interrupt, you hang up your clothes, you go to bed when I tell you to. The men work in the yard, the women work in the kitchen, those kind of things. Most family rules are covert and unstated, and they're inferential. They're drawn from the redundancy principle, repetitive patterns in the relationship. Better ask mom, dad might not be in a good mood. Wait till after supper. Don't be a crybaby. Don't make your parents mad. So children learn and perpetuate these rules, and they pass these rules on to their own children. And particularly if it's functional and problematic, unless those rules and roles are interrupted, then you have clients who come and sit in other people's sessions 20 years later. Virginia Satir, page 76 in 1972, is a pioneer in family therapy. All of these people, Don Jackson, were at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, California, quite often dealing with communication patterns, rigid families, producing what they thought at the time to be schizophrenic families and clients with schizophrenia. Satir argued that dysfunctional families follow dysfunctional rules. So unless you develop awareness around unwritten rules, that you're going to stay stuck in a dysfunctional, non-functional pattern.
So the problem is the rules, the relationship.
The rules, yes. Because, and I'll just use physical corporal punishment, okay? If my granddaddy's way of communicating a broken rule to my father was to slap him upside his head, and had the belt nailed to the wall, so it was a constant reminder of what would happen if you don't do your chores, if you're not respectful, if you don't follow the rules. Okay. It may be very difficult for me to conceptualize my parents as good people who loved me, and also conceptualize corporal punishment as unnecessary, barbaric, brutal. So, if I have to choose between the two, typically. So if I don't want to see my parents as unloving, brutal, I have to say, well, they were right. That's the way we do things. That's the way we teach our children. So then I continue to spank or maybe over-spank my own child. Well, society changes. So in the 30s and 40s, a lot of things happened behind closed doors in families. There was no defects or reporting agency, oversighting agency. Move forward into the 60s, spanking still was occurring in the school system. Corporal punishment was still occurring in the school system. It also occurred with the legal enforcement, law enforcement. Law enforcement had the option, if they saw a 14-year-old kid breaking in a gas station, to take him out back and paddle them and send them on their way. And it was adjudicated on site. Get into the 80s, much more social resistance to corporal punishment, more lawsuits. Things change in the courts, and they change in the media, and they change in the public eye. So being able then to turn around and understand that just because your mom, pa, and Em and I did it this way, that doesn't mean that it's the best way. And what I learned is what I know, and what I know has to be right. So to try to disrupt those types of family rules and roles is going to cause great disequilibrium for those families. Yes, and throw them into some kind of chaos. Walter Cannon, 1932, I don't see that he was on the test, but he does help apply the principle of homeostasis in cybernetic terms to the family. And he says that we exchange information with the outside world from our family, and we receive information from the outside world into our family, and we use feedback processes to maintain internal stability. Well, we don't do it that way in our family. Well, that's not the way we celebrate Christmas or have supper, or that's not who we date, or that's not the church we go to. So, and outside influences in your family are unavoidable and lead to growth. Very, very rigid families are centripetal. They pull to the center and they don't allow outside forces. Very chaotic families are centrifugal and they push outward. And they have too much outside influences. So the goal is to get enough, have boundaries that are neither too rigid or too loose, so the family can be balanced. Yes, ma'am?
No comment.
No? Anthony?
No, ma'am. Just a funny story. I
Um,
can always tell you later.
Okay. So Bateson, also a kind of a founding father of early family theorists and researchers, also a proponent of cybernetic concepts to upset or threaten families, to initiate homeostatic mechanisms to restore, reestablish equilibrium. His name will show up on the licensure exam, Bateson and Jackson, in this.
He says what?
Bateson is a early family systems theorist, along with Don Jackson. At the end of this page, they talk about private codes where families can cue each other non-verbally to regroup. You hurt my feelings. I can have a downturned lip. Your mother wants you to straighten up in public and she gives you the eye. You are getting ready to share something your spouse or partner would not want you to share, and you immediately know because they press your arm or your knee, or they adopt a certain stance that possibly you should leave that part of the conversation alone.
My dad would snap his fingers and I would almost fall down crying because I knew that it's over. It's over.
That's it. You hit it.
Park it. Okay.
78 has a little diagram of ranges of behavior. If you stay kind of like this, you're in the norm. There's some room in healthy families for some variance. Too high, too low causes disequilibrium. Page 79 talks about pathogenic families. Pathogenic families are families where the demand for deviation or change is too great, too sudden, too far beyond the family's tolerance, and they don't have time to get a response together to regain homeostasis. So, families who've had someone incarcerated, families who have had incest or domestic violence perpetrated and then disclosed and have had law enforcement involved, families who are going through divorce, bankruptcies, families who've lost jobs, families who are becoming broken up to go live with other members. Those families become pathogenic because people try to meet their needs. Individuals try to meet their needs the best way they know how. And when they have no healthy coping mechanisms, they find other coping mechanisms that may not be healthy, but they still cope. You can have lawlessness, juvenile delinquency, you can have substance abuse, domestic violence, affairs, cutting behaviors, self-injurious behaviors, Whatever will work to help the family cope, to function. The name of the game is survival. I want to stay alive. I'd like to keep my family together, even if we all live in different houses. Even if I have to make a list of all the brothers, stepsisters, fictive family relationships. And when you're looking at page 80, you need to go to an understanding of first order cybernetics is a machine-based theory on how families operate as a mechanism. Second order cybernetics, or the cybernetics of cybernetics, is where the therapist enters into the family as an equal recursive change agent, part of the observing system, part of the family interactions for change rather than an outsider looking in. Not every theorist operates from that stance, but that's what that term means.
Second order.
Second order. It's on the top of page 80. Family stability is actually rooted in change. If you don't have any change, there's no need for homeostasis, there's just stagnation. Homeostasis means we're here, we have a little dip, we come right back to here. Okay. In healthy families, that's okay. Very dysfunctional, unhealthy families have dramatic shifts in equilibrium that they cannot always regain. Feedback, information, and control. Systems and families are in flux. We have different family members simultaneously pursuing goals, responding to outside forces, trying to find out what's right or wrong. Did you have your hand up? Okay. So, the regulatory mechanism by which the system maintains steady a state so they can achieve their goals is referred to as feedback. On the test that you're going to get at the end of this course, feedback refers to reinserting us into a system the results of what you did last time, past performance, so we can control the system and increasing the system's likelihood of survival. The family's an organism, we want it to survive. Think about it behaviorally, positive and negative feedback. If you do what I want you to do and you follow the rules and you fulfill your role that you have been assigned, I'm going to give you good stuff. You're going to have praise, you're going to be seen as a functional, viable, important member of the family. You're going to have privileges. Positive feedback increases the likelihood of desired behavior. Negative feedback. If you don't do what I want you to do, if you don't follow the rules and you don't stay within your role, you're not going to have privileges. You're not going to be seen as a viable member of the family. It still increases the likelihood of the desired behavior because the removal of those positive things means that the family member is going to want to do the things that they can to receive the positive things, so it increases the likelihood of behavior. Punishment, shunning, physical abuse, punishment, all adversive reactions always increase the likelihood of the undesirable behavior. So, if I can't be a member, if I can't be the white sheep, I can sure be the black sheep. No cultural issues intended in that, but if I can't be the good kid, the good son, I can certainly be the scapegoated bad kid.
So adversive feedback always
Reinforces the undesired behavior. And you'll have, particularly in siblings, but you would, it used to be more common, like with two brothers, the older and younger brother, you had the good son, and you had, I don't know what happened with the second one, because people want to meet our behavior is goal-directed and purpose-driven, as Adler pointed out, and if I can't get positive stuff from you and be noticed that way, I can get your attention through some very negative.
So is it safe to assume that a child who is acting out like that has been subject to adversive feedback?
Typically, they're trying to meet their needs, usually for attention, or for power, or for revenge. Same Adlerian concepts. Right, let's look at feedback loops. Circular mechanisms whose purpose is to introduce information about a system's output back to the input. I want to alter, correct, govern the system's functioning. So if you do it again, it goes back to very strict behavioral terms. Information feedback is negative or positive. It's not a value judgment. It doesn't refer to whether the information is good or bad. Either the feedback opposes the deviation, so we can go back to status quo and maintain homeostasis. We want to minimize, resist negative changes, or we're going to accept it. We're going to accommodate it. We're going to move forward and modify our structure to accept this positive change, both self-corrective. If your child grows up and gets married, gains a partnership, gains a child of their own, there has to be room in the family boundaries to allow these new people to come in. And many grown children are terribly hurt by their nuclear family if their partner's not accepted, whether it's same-sex or heterosexual relationships. If my partner, my children, my stepchildren, my partner's children are not accepted in the family fold, tremendous hurt, tremendous gaps in that. Negative feedback information about the performance of the system triggers necessary change to put you back on track. Positive feedback, which are also called amplifying feedback loops on the test, has the opposite effect. It changes the system to allow this. Negative feedback closes it down and says we're not going to have it. Positive feedback says this might be okay, let's open up for this. Page 82, 83, they give you a Goldenberg from 2002, give an illustration of the operation of negative and positive feedback loops for married couples, remarried couples, and how the therapist worked with them. Page 83, depends on the degree of calibration, is still back to the mechanistic, machine-oriented model. Calibration is how much deviation will we allow before we close you down. And that can be about anything. A family that's very academic may not want to allow a child to finish high school and work a blue-collar job. A family that is always been very law-abiding might have a drastic, catastrophic response to a child who's gotten into a small amount of trouble with the law. And so instead of allowing that child to come back and having just enough negative feedback to say this is not the way we do things, where they can jump back on board, the family can completely derail and the child continue with punishment and adverse consequences to continue that line until they're then incarcerated. It doesn't mean that it's always the family's fault or the parents' fault. It's not looking at it from a position of blame. It's looking at families just how things occur, what happens. Information processing. This is where you have mixed messages. And if I don't understand what it is you're communicating to me non-verbally, I may not know what it is that you want me to do. So, it's very difficult, and I don't believe this is as common as it used to be in the 50s and 60s, but many women who are angry used to smile. They would never change that positive outward countenance. So while they're hurt or they're angry and they're trying to express their these emotions, these deep emotions, they would continue to be very polite and to smile. That message can be misconstrued. A single mother who's very interested in her child not getting in trouble with the police that comes out with such a strong, I'm going to be your mother and your father both. Those messages can be misconstrued and misunderstood. Looking at subsystems are part of the overall big system. The super system is typically the community. Families, communities, neighborhoods, or smaller subsystems. Within the family, it's the parent, the couple dyad, the parent dyad, and then the relationship between each parent and each child, the sibling relationships, and the parents as a whole. The mother to all children, the mother to each individual child, the father to each individual child, the father to all children, and the parent as a parental system to each individual child and to all the children. The basic, most enduring subsystems are spousal, parental, and sibling. Decisions are made to how we stay together, to manage conflict, to meet each other's sexual dependency needs, plan the future, provide for intimacy, support, mutual growth, and opportunity for personal development. Socioeconomic and class overlays add to family stability or lack of stability. It doesn't mean that you can't have functioning, stable families with lower socioeconomic status, or families that have higher socioeconomic status still experience a great many problems. But the lack of socioeconomic power typically adds to the existing problem. Rebelliousness, intergenerational conflicts, runaways, reflect family instability and disorganization. In working class families, parents sometimes share parental authority and responsibility with grandparents, other relatives, neighborhoods. It can become very muddied. Boundaries. A boundary is an invisible line of demarcation that separates me as an individual or as a subsystem or a system from my outside surroundings. Separates my family from other families in the neighborhood. Separates me from my other siblings. Separates me as a daughter, a wife, a sister. And separates me as the individual person for who I am. The family boundary is a gatekeeper function. It controls information in and out of the system. It doesn't matter what your friends' parents allow them to do. This is what we do. It doesn't matter if you hear this at home. You keep the business of the family within these four walls. Very much, these interactive processes are very much Minuchin structural therapy driven. Open and closed systems on page 86. Open systems. The boundaries are easily crossed. Information flows freely from outside and inside. Boundaries that are very tight and rigid and information is not easily crossed is a closed system. Families that with very open, permeable systems become chaotic. This has been repeated before. Closed systems can become stagnant. In family terms, no system usually is ever fully open or fully closed. If it were totally open, there would be no boundaries between the family and the outside world, and the family would not exist as a separate entity. It's totally closed, there's no exchange with the outside world, and the family would die. So, all families operate in some degree as an open system, but some are very much more closed in the sense of being very rigid or very insular. The more open, adaptable, accessible to change a family is, allows the family usually to survive, to thrive, to be open to new experiences, to discard interactive patterns that are not good for them. That family has negentropy, a tendency toward maximum order. That question is on the final exam for this course. The lack of openness leads for closed systems to run the risk of entropy. They gradually regress, they decay, they stagnate, they don't have enough outside information for them not to become disorganized, disordered, particularly if they're triggered by prolonged stress. Closed systems fail to make enabling adaptations. They seal themselves off, they stagnate, and they die.
Maximum order here isn't insinuating rigidity.
No, it's maximum functionality.
Okay.
Okay? Families and larger systems, how the family interacts with the legal system, the educational system, the healthcare, churches, welfare, probations, neighborhoods, communities, any system outside of the family as a whole. When you are looking for when families have problems and they go to certain types of therapists, sometimes those therapists see themselves as consultants, or the consultants may be from systems within the community, like the school system, or the DFACS, or a doctor's office. And they talk about mapping the ecosystem, evaluating how the family defines itself, who's included, how they interact. Do they interact well with law enforcement? Probably not when the children's in
the youth detention center. Do they interact well with defects? Probably not, if the children have been removed out of the home. Do they interact well with the school system? Probably not if they have a truancy case before the court. So in distress, it's what usually brings these consultants from broader community systems into the family. An eco-map definition is a useful appraisal device. It's a diagramming the family's connection to other larger super systems within the community. That's also adapted from general systems theory. It's an assessment technique used by social workers and defects workers to try to coordinate maximum helping services for the family. Let's get them a doctor, a psychiatrist, let's get an adjudication officer at the juvenile court, let's get a social worker out there, let's get defects on board with a caseworker, let's get them some systemic help across all of the systems available in the community to help this family survive and then possibly reorganize, function, and thrive. Eco-maps help organize and clarify stressors and supports in the family system. Stressors are risk factors, supports are protective factors. And how can we do this? Ember Black, who was a feminist theory, gives a case study at the bottom of page 89 and 90. She also shows an ecosystem for this family, the graphic at the top of page 90. That's an eco-map. And the family has access to certain systemic resources, but individual members may have fewer or more than the family as a whole. So, subsystems carry out specific family functions. Families are complex relationship systems. Causality is circular and multidimensional. Family rules, for the most part, are unstated, and negative feedback tells you what's going wrong, so we can go back to homeostasis. Positive feedback says let's move our boundaries out a little bit to accept something new. Okay?
So even though a family can maintain homeostasis even in dysfunction, it's usually an outside source that causes the family to have to come to counseling? Or that causes...
As long as the doors are closed and nobody knows what's going on, the family can operate in dysfunction without discovery. But if a child goes to school with a bruise, if a child breaks the law and gets caught, if the parent is discovered to have substance abuse issues or winds up 1013 in crisis stabilization, or has an affair, or gets fired and the family can't pull together, the house is foreclosed on, anything that so affects the family they cannot then operate behind closed doors because they are having very negative interactions with larger community systems. Then as those systems come in to evaluate, assess, help the family, the dysfunctions become apparent. As the family's under those stressors, their ability to function disintegrates.
So it's not normally going to be an internal thing that causes them to seek help. It's usually going to be something that...
Usually as long as it goes on and it's not undiscovered, it just continues to go on until it is discovered. And that particular case is incest. That example. Questions, thoughts?
No?
We're good? I think the following chapter is chapter 5. We have one more chapter on this background. Starting with chapter 6 through chapter 14, we will look at the theories individually. All right, guys, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you at the next module. At least we got it done.